The Over the Top, Under the Radar end of year Christmas special is happening. It's a live event. It's the 11th of December at the Bernie Grant Arts Centre, Tottenham.
Tickets start from £8. We have Labour MP Bel Ribeiro Addy joining us. Don't miss out.
Hi, I'm Carys Afoco.
And I'm Gary Young.
Every week, Gary and I will talk about those stories in the news that are overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough.
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar. So, Carys, how you been?
Do you know what? I'm in a place of seeking escapism, and that place has led me to trashy romantic novels about fairies.
Oh, wow. I didn't see that coming.
I like to surprise you, keep you on your toes, you know.
Tell me more.
It's a best-selling series, American author. A friend recommends it. It's big with, I think Gen Zs, or at least people on TikTok, A Court of Thorns and Roses. And it's just sexy nonsense. I guess it's like Bridgerton, but a book series.
Sexy nonsense with fairies.
Yeah, not like little fairies. They're kind of more like elves, if that makes sense. They're just immortal beings that have powers.
Elves giving it to each other in National Trust homes.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's just,
Okay.
You know, when you feel like, I just feel like this reality I'm not into. So I was just like, let me go to another reality where fairies exist. Yeah, getting their groove on. What about you? What have you been up to? What have you been up to?
Not that. Not
So
fairy
you would just
sex.
want to read something where you're like, this is so unlike my life and world that it's just pure escapism, you know?
Oh, yeah. No, I like trash. But everybody's trash is different.
Not into the fairies.
Tinkerbell meets Bridgerton. That's new, you know.
I think it's more Lord of the Rings because I just think she calls them fairies, but I think they're more like elves. You know, they're like slender and tall and they got powers. Wait, so what's your escapism? Come on.
I watch films I've seen many times already that I know I'm going to like. It's the prawn korma of entertainment.
Give me an example.
Bearing in mind, I'm not going to stand by these as works of art, but many things with Will Ferrell in them, including Old School, The Campaign, stuff like that, things that make me laugh, Talladega Nights, Love Jones, which I talked about last week, Quiz Show, which I think we saw together once, but usually things that make me laugh or that are kind of highly stylized. And I used to watch Seinfeld, and then when Seinfeld's, I think maybe his wife, but him as well, gave some money to the kind of pro-Israeli people, some of whom thugged up the students at UCLA. I honestly stopped finding him funny. And I went round in circles about, well, you found Seinfeld funny for a long time. Is it really not funny now? And it kind of isn't. It's a bit like, if I watch reruns of the UK Office now, I kind of think a bit differently because I loved it at first, but now I think Ricky Gervais has been a bit of a prick. And
so you've got like an inbuilt cancellation machine when the artist becomes annoying.
Yeah, and I'm not advocating anything. If I liked it, I'd own it. And then it would be like, yeah, it's a little bit embarrassing, but I like it. Or kind of, I don't like him, but I like it. But then at a certain point when they cross a line, I'm like,
I mean, this connects to one of my things for this week. I don't have an inbuilt cancellation thing. There's certain artists, musical artists I'm thinking of where I know they're not great, but still think some of their songs slap.
We got a message from Kevin on Patreon who said, following Carys's "Are you pregnant?" story, my guy story was I asked one female work colleague if she was pregnant. No. Sometime later, I asked another female work colleague. No. I resolved to stay away from that question, do you think? And then a colleague who I was convinced was pregnant, but I didn't want to ask, see above, I asked a mutual friend and her response was, ask her, which wasn't helpful. Eventually I got round to asking her, are you with child? And she laughed as she nodded. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Kevin. But I have a question for you, Kevin.
Kevin.
Maybe you will come back to us, which is, Why do you need to know? What you could have concluded from those first two things was like, yeah, maybe they are, maybe they're not. And maybe they'll tell me, or maybe they won't.
Well, I took something different, that he'd been so sort of cowed by the first two attempts that this woman was like basically ready to burst, like very visibly pregnant, and he was still like nervous. That's kind of where I went. His like desk mate, who's literally like sighing as she sits down, like got the like very visible, and he's just like, well, I better not ask. So Kevin, tell us which it is.
Big shout out to the people who signed up to Patreon this week. This week's new sign-ups, Anna, Jenny and Brenda. Thanks so much to all of you. It makes a big difference.
We have 348 amazing, generous people who are supporting the podcast via Patreon. We are trying to get to 400 Patreon supporters by Christmas. So that's 25th of December, not long now. So we need 52 amazing people to donate, to support the podcast, to keep it going, to pay everyone involved. Packages start at just £5 a month. So if you want to keep the show running and also get access to bonus episodes, our weekly newsletter, access to the very exclusive and very fun over under WhatsApp community, just go to the Patreon website, patreon.com, and search Over the Top, Under the Radar. To everyone who's supporting us, thank you so much. And if you can afford to make a gift to the podcast, please do so.
So, Carys, what's your under?
My under the radar is a young man called Ibrahima Bah. Ibrahima was born in Senegal, and like many people, he made the journey from West Africa to Libya, Libya to France, and then France to the UK. It's not disputed that he experienced forced labour on that journey, modern slavery, while he was in Mali. And in December 2022 at 2 a.m, he was piloting a dinghy that was trying to get from France to the UK with about 50 people on it, 5 of whom died. So some context for those who don't read a lot about small boats or about channel crossings is the people, the gangs that get paid to smuggle people across the sea don't pilot the dinghies. They pick someone who's going to cross to pilot the dinghy, and they often pick the youngest person or the youngest looking person, not for benevolent reasons, but on the basis that they think they might still get asylum. So Ibrahima makes it to France. He says that he will pilot the dinghy, and then he takes a look at the boat and sees that it's not seaworthy. And according to his testimony, he refuses. He says, I don't want to pilot this boat. It's not safe. The smugglers have guns and knives. And again, according to his testimony, he is beaten up and forced to pilot the boat. Dozens of people, 4 days, 4 nights. The boat isn't seaworthy. It's taking on water. And at 2 a.m. off the coast of Dover, it's rescued by a commercial fishing vessel and the RNLI. Some reports say the French ignored the boat, let it get to Dover. They knew it was in trouble. What isn't in dispute is that 5 people died, one of whom was a young boy called Alaji, who Ibrahima referred to as his brother. So there were a lot of things that happened to Ibrahima that were unlucky, but the worst was when he made the crossing, because in 2022, the Conservative government passed something called the Nationality and Borders Act. So it got passed in June, and Ibrahima made his crossing in December. It makes it an offence to arrive in the UK to claim asylum. So there's a new offence that was created called the offence of illegal arrival. And effectively, it means that you can't come and claim asylum in the UK legally, which is problematic and awful for lots of reasons. It's been condemned by the UN, but basically, Ibrahima made this crossing 6 months after the law passed and has now become the first person earlier this year to be sentenced to prison for manslaughter. He got, I think, a 9.5-year sentence earlier this year. And this week he is requesting, and his lawyers requesting, the right to appeal the sentence. He made history as the first person trying to claim asylum to be sent to prison for manslaughter. There are a couple of things that just really sit badly with me, and I don't think there's a way to make a sunny spin on this. The first is that the testimony of the people on the boat is that Ibrahim tried to save them. They called him an angel. They talked about him trying to save lives. He's one of the last people on the dinghy as they are dragging people out. There was a boat called the Arcturus that was involved in the rescue. It was a commercial fishing boat, and one of the guys on that boat gave an interview with GB News and talked about not wanting to let the boat into the UK, wanting to take them back to France. and referring to it as like a migrant taxi. So there's this incredibly loaded political language used by people involved in the rescue. And then there's the fact of Ibrahima's age. He has a birth certificate that says he's 17. So there's a dispute about how old he is, and the judge decides, despite there being a birth certificate, that he is 20. He's treated as an adult, even though there's evidence to suggest that he is a child. Aside from like how appalling and disgusting it is that we now live in a country where people are sent to prison for the crime of being refugees, I think there's something really specific about what happened to Ibrahima that is about him being a young black man and about the adultification, which is an academic term, but I think it kind of does what it says on the tin, of young black people and mixed race people. And this is from like a UK government report. Notions of innocence and vulnerability are not afforded to certain children. This is determined by people and institutions who hold power over them, always founded within discrimination and bias, and the impact results in children's rights being either diminished or not upheld. I think it's a symptom of how far things have gone around the politicization of channel crossings and small boats and refugees. The case didn't get a ton of coverage when it first happened. I doubt it will get a ton of coverage now. There are people protesting outside of the court. It would be foolish to let this go under our radar or to not see it as like a canary down the coal mine. And there have been other cases in other countries where we're seeing not just refugees being criminalized, but the people trying to save their life being criminalized. Yeah, and it's a hard one to talk about and it's incredibly upsetting, but I think it's our job to engage with it. We need to repeal this legislation. There are no plans to do so at present, but we've effectively breached our Geneva Convention commitments, and there's not really a legal way to come and be a refugee in the UK. There is no legal or safe way to come and claim asylum. And now beyond that, we are criminalising those who come and claim asylum. So that's my under the radar. It's not a cheery one, Gary, but I think it's pretty important.
Yeah, no, it's a very powerful and distressing story. The notion of him being criminalized, particularly given the testimony of the people on the boat, is horrendous. The idea of the criminal not being the people who've made it so hard that people are dying in the sea, the people who actually at one point, 10 years ago, they made the decision not to save people who were drowning. This was in the Mediterranean because it would encourage them. The idea that that's not criminal, but that him, because he's got a hand on the tiller, regardless of his power in that situation, is offensive. And anyone who just cannot get their empathetic tendrils around the idea that that might be them, or that might be someone that they know, that you might be that desperate. What do you achieve by sending him to jail? Apart from illuminating your absolute lack of humanity.
This was a really traumatic thing that happened to him. Just the thought of going through that, of being, as an incredibly young person, responsible for all those lives, of losing someone that you had become friends with. And he stayed on the boat and tried to save all of these people. And then he comes to this country and is put in jail. You know, he's already served 14 months in prison, and it's a whole separate conversation about immigration detention and the fact that we think people who come to this country can just be thrown in jail so that we know where they are. As you say, it's like a lack of humanity and a lack of compassion. And something for me about, he had two trials. The first was a hung jury. The second was an all-white jury, and 10 to 12 found him guilty of manslaughter and, you know, and the crime of trying to enter the UK to claim asylum. That is also, everything about it is upsetting. And, you know, me being upset doesn't help Ibrahima. But I think us talking about it does, and us, you know, really reckoning with quite how dark our immigration and asylum policies are.
I'm kind of asking our listeners and beyond, do you want this in your name? Do you know what I mean? This is our state. It's supposed to be. One might argue it's never been our state, but like, it's the state we live in. It's the government we pay taxes to. It's the people that we vote for. It's the laws that are legislated through the people who we vote for. You pay for this stuff one way or another. You really do. I mean, you pay psychically to be a country that does that to people. We shouldn't be under any illusion that there is not going to be any kind of karmic result for that, which, once again, is not going to help him. We have to make noise to help him, and we just have to keep going. Now, the one thing I would add, which is just that there has been this adultification, as you so rightly described it, which we see in other ways with black kids. So Child Q, the young girl who was thought to have drugs in the school, and she didn't, as far as I know, but even if she did, she was strip searched while she was on a period. Not that there's a good time to strip search a young girl. And there was just a sense that, like, yeah, well, that's okay. And there was a study by the American Psychological Association, their online journal of personality and social psychology. And it showed that white Americans overestimate the age of black boys over the age of 10 by an average of 4.5 years. And that white respondents assumed black children were more culpable, more aware of their guilt, more knowingly guilty than white kids or Latinos. And so we have a sense of a collective responsibility for children. That's why we have social services. That's why we have children's courts. And there's some way that these don't count as kids. That sickens me, both as a human being and as a father and as a black person. It absolutely sickens me.
Yeah, and I think the thing that, I didn't mention, but I did want to refer to, because I think it sums it up, is when Ibrahima was sentenced earlier this year, the Home Office tweeted a mugshot with the banner "jailed" above it. And I look at that picture and I see like a child, and I feel incredibly, incredibly sad for this young man who has had a terrible run of bad luck. But yeah, that reality that the product of racism and like constructed racism, the lies that were told and retold to justify things like the transatlantic slave trade or colonialism, part of, to do the things that have been done to black people to them, you have to say, well, they aren't even really children. These people aren't even really human. But like something about the Home Office gloating and tweeting a picture of Ibrahima with like "jailed" above it, for me just felt like, yeah, they're sort of icing on top of just a really terrible story. I think we also, we just we can't look away from this. We have to look at it and sort of, accept, as you said, there can only be a reckoning for this. This isn't the way to run an asylum system or migration system. And if you look at Ibrahima and don't see a child, there's something wrong with your eyes. So that's why I'm reading sexy fairy books, Gary.
Yeah, well, rock on sexy fairies. That's all I can say. So my under is that just last week, the Belgian state was found guilty of crimes against humanity for the forced removal of mixed-race children from their mothers in colonial Congo. The background to this is that Belgium was the colonial authority in the Congo. It was absolutely ruthless and brutal dictatorship that they had there under the Belgians. Some children were born to white Belgian men and local black women. The Belgian state decided that the existence of those mixed-race children interrupted the racial hierarchies that they'd set up. And so they forcibly removed those children as small children from their mothers and sent them to Catholic institutions where they were quite often abused, told they were the children of sin. These particular women who got the reparations, which were first denied on the grounds that it was they'd reached a statute of limitations, but then granted because it was understood as a crime against humanity. They were between 48 and 53. But when Belgium left the Congo in 1960, a large number of children, mixed-race children, were forcibly removed from their mothers. I've spoken to a couple, actually, one of whom was removed at gunpoint from her mum and taken to Belgium, where they didn't have citizenship, where they were put often with families that didn't really want them. They were separated from their families and often didn't know what had happened to their families. This is not a small number of people. This was 20,000 children that Belgium did this to, more or less. Of course, it's up for us to keep the numbers. And there are a few things that I want to say about this. The first is, we talk about post-colonial world, but colonialism is not over. It's just 2 years ago that the Belgians returned Patrice Lumumba's tooth. Patrice Lumumba was the man who spearheaded the anti-colonial struggle in the Congo. The CIA, the Belgian state, and some regional people in the Congo didn't like him. They murdered him. They dissolved his body in acid. One Belgian copper kept his tooth, and the Belgians wouldn't give it back until 2 years ago. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Berlin. I was with some Namibians who were returning to Leipzig to take back the remains of their ancestors. So these things aren't over. The second thing I want to say is this is not an issue that's unique to Belgium. Between 63 and 82, the French state forcibly removed around 2,000 children from the island department of Reunion, which is as much a part of France as the Dordogne or the Ardennes. They removed 2,000 children, most of them were in care, sent them 9,000 kilometers away to rural France, where they were used as cheap labor, farmhands, servants of wealthy families living in appalling conditions. 82, they stopped there. The majority were under 16, a third were under 5 when they were taken away. And the third thing is that we sometimes get trapped in an understanding of America and American racism that doesn't give us the space to also look at European racism and colonialism. And Europeans love that. They love to say, well, racism is something that comes from America, really. It's not so bad here. I think you can hold both things in your head at the same time. Racism in this context is a white thing. It's not a regional thing. But I do think that we would benefit from looking more at the pan-European nature of racism and the way in which colonialism is still playing out. And I do think that that is an area which is understudied and in a sense undervalued.
Well, it's a good news under, which we like. Really impressive, especially because it's in Belgium that they found that the Belgian state has misbehaved and that the women are due reparations. So that's, a victory for justice. I think the thing for me, in addition to this idea of the way that we erase European racism and like comfort ourselves by focusing on American racism, I think it's an interesting one. And I remember an African-American colleague coming to the UK for the first time and being excited. And then she's like, then I realized this is where racism comes from. Yeah, it's kind of rich, this idea of like always pointing over at the Atlantic when the sort of colonial project, the transatlantic slave trade, have European origins, similar to anti-Semitism. That is an overlooked and interesting thing, which is about European self-image. I also think it's interesting that this was a lot of mixed race children. And I think that some identities are like inherently political. I find it interesting when people talk about not caring about politics, not wanting to bother with politics. For some people, like your existence is political. Like in the case of those women, it was like the existence of mixed race children is basically a reminder of presumably systematic rape of Congolese women. I can't imagine what it was like to be those women and to be trafficked and taken from your home and treated like you were sinful because your father did something horrible or was horrible. Yeah, and it makes you think about who has the luxury of not being political or kind of not thinking about politics. But ultimately, good news story. This means lots of people could be getting reparations. Are they getting money?
I think they are going to get money, although it's not clear how much. And this is just 5 people, but there are about 20,000 people affected by this. I think that there's a certain period where the existence of mixed race kids becomes almost like a category error. It's like, look, we know what to do with black and we know what to do with white, but this group of people shouldn't really exist. Now, what they did in America is they kind of gave them in most of America, they gave them a certain set of privileges might be accorded to them in a kind of pigmentocracy. And that also happened in a lot of the Caribbean. But the Belgians were like, no, we just, we do black and white. We don't do shades. So you got to go. And that was very similar to what, after the American GIs came to Europe and some children were born, that was basically the feeling in Germany and Britain and Holland and elsewhere where these kids were born was, it's a category error. We can't deny that they're from here because their mums are from here, but we can not cope with the idea that they are also German or Dutch or British. It's just too much. So they were born a problem.
And I think it's worth digging into like why you're a problem. No, I say this as someone who has mixed heritage, which I guess you can't tell if you're listening. My father is black, my mother is white. But it's because interracial relationships and mixed race children, like in a pretty on the nose way, just make it clear that race is a construct and a nonsense, and we're all just human beings, but some of our identities have been constructed in a certain way. Yeah, I mean, I wonder, is there any amount of money for those women that will make up for that, for like your formative years being, you can't be in the place that you consider home, you can't know your family. And I think it is worth saying that whilst reparations in this case is a form of justice, the idea that it can substitute for like a happy home and family life, I'm not sure if that's true.
I mean, it can't be made right, but what it does mean is an acceptance and an understanding that, first of all, it was very wrong and that they are now seen as being wronged. And secondly, this notion that, but that was before racism was wrong. It was a long time ago, which is how Europe does colonialism, right? Why do you keep going on about old stuff? And it establishes it as not being old and that it is, you did these things. It will never return their childhood and the broken relationships with their families. The woman I spoke to who didn't know whether her sister and brother were alive for years, didn't see her mum for years. You can't make that right, but it can establish that it was wrong.
So my over the top is Greg Wallace. Do you know who Greg Wallace is? Do you watch him on telly? Do you watch MasterChef?
Well, I know who he is because I read the news, but I didn't know who he was when it first started.
Interesting. Yeah, so Greg Wallace has been presenting MasterChef, or the various parts of the MasterChef franchise, which is like cooking show. It's a big family favorite in the Risa Foco family. Greg is one of the presenters. He presents like Celebrity MasterChef, regular MasterChef, all the MasterChefs. He's been doing it for 20 years. He is 60 years old, which will become a bit relevant later. In the last few weeks and months, he's had to take a step back from MasterChef amidst allegations of misconduct from multiple women. So there are a couple of things that I want to talk about with you. The first is Greg himself, presumably against or ignoring the advice of his publicity team and management, posted an Instagram video on Sunday in which he decided to defend himself. And basically, he didn't deny the accusations. What he said was, I've been doing this for 20 years. If you think about the number of complaints there have been in the context of how many contestants there have been, so like thousands, it's barely anyone, for his first line of defense. And then his second was, and this is the thing that really sent the media into overdrive, and I want to get into why it got so much coverage, was that he was like, if you look at who's making the complaints, it's a set of middle-class women of a certain age. Greg has quite quickly retracted those comments, and I believe maybe even deleted the video. The bit I'm not so sure about, I'm interested in your take, is we had Rupert Huck in Parliament saying that episodes of MasterChef shouldn't be aired over Christmas, which I don't feel strongly about, but I'm like, is that like, does that mean all the contestants who've done all their cooking and things can't be shown? Is that something any of the people who've made complaints about has asked for? Yeah, something about it feels a bit overblown, even though I am not out here defending Greg Wallace or his actions. So what do you reckon?
His case has been really interesting for me, as well as just generally. When I left for America, I was 34. And when I came back, I was 46. And I realized when I came back, you know what? Not that I was doing anything really super crazy before, but like, you're an older man now. And so there's a bunch of stuff that you can't say or do. You're not going to be throwing your arms around colleagues. You're going to have to shut up a bit. There isn't much of a barrier for you talking. Race notwithstanding, there's not a barrier for you talking here, where there's younger people and there are women for who, like, I had to readjust my behavior. And I've got to say, I didn't find it terribly difficult. And I do like an off-color joke, as you know. What he was doing was, people kept saying, can you stop that? It's kind of, it's icky. It strikes me as the things he was doing were kind of like priapic, immature, wrong. They're wrong. Offensive, not least because when people asked him to stop, he wouldn't stop. The reason that he was still working there was because he was a celebrity and he'd become a celebrity, even if I didn't know he was. And I think that, I saw that Keir Starmer's office had kind of weighed in, and I thought, this doesn't feel like a thing for Parliament. This kind of
It's
and
number
the
10
kind of
and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and this backbench MP who said you can't even show the MasterChef episodes anymore.
and I kind of I gotta be honest, I do think it'll be a bit weird to watch it. I'm not sure that bit weird would be a qualification for therefore binning it, but I can see the problem that they have. Well, can we watch this in the same way? Can we screen this in the same way? I kind of think that they could, but I don't think it's a crazy call not to. I would add this as well, because I was talking about Will Ferrell, that argument, Will Ferrell makes that argument in the campaign, and it's where he makes an absolutely disgusting, lewd phone call to the wrong number. And then he says, my comments were crude and inappropriate, but I've made 10,000 calls in my life, and maybe 2% of those have been inappropriate. So what's that? And I don't know, I can't remember what it is. 20,000 calls? He says, I'll take those odds any day. It's like, dude, that is mental. The idea that you're going to defend yourself by saying, well, it's just 2% of all the calls I made. That's just 20,000 calls. And that's a really good strike rate. And the other thing I think is interesting is that the people he dismissed, middle-class women of a certain age, it's like, dude, I'm afraid quite a lot of them have got quite a lot of power.
Yeah.
And just for your own self-benefit, you probably don't want to be dismissing that group of people.
I think it's funny, he sort of kind of snitches on himself with his defense, because part of the reason, so Kirsty Walk is one of the most high-profile people who's said something about Greg Wallace. Presumably she went on like a celebrity MasterChef or something. She is, for listeners who don't know, a high-profile BBC current affairs presenter, did things like Newsnight. So Kirsty Walk came out, like, part of the reason that people who are on record complaining are of a certain age and of a certain class is that those people have more privilege and power and are less vulnerable than, say, the 20-something production assistants who are likely all on freelance contracts and low wages and aren't middle class. It doesn't mean they're cool with you, bro. It just means that they don't have the professional resilience or like the established careers to be able to come out and talk smack about a really famous TV presenter. And I think the bit that all of this kind of revolves around for me is that there's no understanding of the positional power he has. And I think the media covers all scandals like this almost in the same way, like forensically picking over and sort of trying to keep juicing the story. And like, let's be clear, Greg Wallace is not in the same camp as someone like a Harvey Weinstein, but how he's behaved at work is really inappropriate. To assume that the only people uncomfortable are the ones who've complained, I think is a misunderstanding of how much power he holds in the workplace when he's showing up presenting a TV show. At the end of the day, if 12 years ago someone said to you, hey, we've had complaints from women, you got to stop making weird sex jokes, and like 12 years on, he's still doing it, I just think, take out the identity, take out the context. If you are at work and your bosses and superiors tell you not to do something and you keep doing it, I mean, it's just a choice there, isn't there? Pretty straightforward choice.
My over, and I'm aware that I might sound like a stuck record on this, but at the time of recording, it hasn't happened yet. But they're already over the top, which is Keir Starmer's reset. He's going to make a speech. I think it is going to be Thursday. He's making it of this week. And so he's planning this reset because he's tanking. His approval ratings are tanking. I said a few weeks ago that Labour was crashing in local by-elections. Most of the swing is going to reform. Apparently, he's not made the speech yet at the time of recording, but he's going to talk about house building and NHS waiting times, maybe about the railways. My feeling about this is, first of all, it's over the top because even before he said it, the journalists are publishing his press releases as though it's real, without any element of skepticism, or they just quote him saying, this plan for change is the most ambitious yet honest program for government in a generation, Starmer said. mission-led government does not mean picking milestones. This is being quoted from The Guardian. It's like, it's not the Soviet Union in 1951. We don't have to just publish what these things say. We don't have to act as stenographers for them. Starmer will stand by controversial moves to increase inheritance tax on farmland. Is it controversial? Is it? I know that some farmers didn't like it, but I'm not sure that makes it controversial. And bind his new ministers to new pledges and key targets. And, he says we're going to have a reset. And then the media are like, he's going to have a reset. Oh, hey, everybody's going to wait and see what the man says and then write about it. You don't have to carry his water for him. And that's the first thing. It's not just bad journalism. It's also, in my opinion, it's bad politics. And there is politics in journalism, even if you don't think there is. The second is that this centre-left project is not working. Didn't work in America, election time. It's not working in France, where the government looks like it's going to collapse. It's not working in Germany, where they've called an election and it looks like the centre-left government is going to collapse. And you know who benefits? The far right. So this isn't the left that is failing. It's a group of people who've actually made their business to marginalize the left. It's like, okay, you've got the show now. What are you going to do with it? And they don't know what to do with it, which brings me to my third point, which is that one of the things I found intriguing when I came back from the States in 2015, when I left, we were about to go to war. Blair was Prime Minister. When I came back, Labour had lost, and it looked like Jeremy Corbyn was going to be leader of the Labour Party. It was like, what the fuck? From that moment, I was intrigued by how the opposition to him never really tried to engage with why he was popular. They just said, he's terrible, he can't win an election. They couldn't engage with like, well, what's happened? Apart from sort of saying, well, just people have gone mad or whatever. And I came out with bogus stuff like, oh, it's the £3 people who've got nothing to do with Labour, which is not true. And he proved it wasn't true by effectively being deposed, standing again and winning his job back. The fact that those people didn't like Corbyn, I think, fine, that's up to you. But then you've got to replace it with something. All they stood for is power. They have it now, and they don't know what to do with it. Starmer's had 10 pledges. He's had 5 missions. He's had 6 first steps before the election. He stood for election. He won. He's got no plan. His plan was to carry on with the same tax and spend things that the Tories did. There is a real danger here that this failure, and at the moment it is a failure, and it's a failure of his politics, but it's also a failure of journalism to hold him to account, I believe, will actually pave the way for the far right. I saw earlier this week that Reform have eclipsed the Tories in Wales and are level pegging with Labour there. This is really serious. This wouldn't be my wish to have Starmer lead the Labour Party in a direction in a way that he's done. But given that that's where we are, this needs to succeed. And it's not succeed. It is horrible. And this reset, it's like, what about the set? How about the first time? What was wrong with what you did first? There is something fundamentally wrong here. And it's not going to be made right by having another few numbers and another few jingly type proposals.
Happy to talk about the reset. I think one thing I would disagree with you on is the reset hasn't been covered entirely positively, but weirdly, some of the more, I would say, sort of interesting coverage has been from the right-wing press, who obviously aren't fans of the Labour Party. So, I think the first thing to say is if you've got a reset less than 6 months after you won a general election victory, like, you're not in a good place. And if you're having to message a reset, like, you're not in a good place. But actually, and I don't want to plug right-wing media, but The Spectator in particular had an interesting comparison of like, is Keir Starmer a bit Rishi Sunak? The idea that most voters are paying attention to all these 5 or 6 or 10 or 8-point plans. Most people didn't know what Keir Starmer's pledges were when he first made them. The idea that like a big speech from someone that most people don't find very interesting or inspiring is like going to fix things, I think is indicative of a bad position they're in. It's like going to couples counselling 6 months in the relationship. Sure, maybe it's super helpful, but like, should you be going this early on? Does this maybe suggest the relationship isn't good? I think he's in a bad place, and I don't think any amount of like spin can spin him out of it. It's interesting that Keir Starmer and a lot of the team around him want to compare him to New Labour and to Tony Blair. And their narrative, as much as they had one, was that, they were purging. I mean, it's not the narrative he won the Labour leadership on, but not long after becoming Labour leader, he sort of took on the mantle as this, avenger who was going to purge the Labour Party of its left wing, who, as you point out, had been resoundingly popular with the party's membership at least. But that in itself isn't a political project or a mission, and it's not enough to have the support of the British people. It's quite a sort of niche, wonky thing. And I think that he doesn't have a communications problem, he has a substance problem. The idea you can just sort of give a speech and dig your way out of this hole, that only really works if your politician is an amazing communicator. Absolutely no shade to Keir Starmer, but he's not that guy. And I guess the final thing for me is
a bit shady. There is some shade there.
Well, it's no shade intended. He's just not that guy, and you've got to know yourself. I know my, that's the journey of life we're all on. Learn who you are and who you're not, what you can do and what you can't do. He's not going to give a speech that's going to change people's minds. Which kind of brings me to my final point, which is there's a lot of retreading of New Labour people now. There's this fetishization of Tony Blair and New Labour that I think really misunderstands why they were successful and what they did well. These are the people who said, once you're sick of repeating a message, it's when the public will finally understand. It's you're sort of repeating some of the dance moves, but you're offbeat. They had things to say. They had a policy agenda. They had a political vision. It wasn't one that I wholly shared, but that meant that by the time you got to the general election, they had the pledge card. They had the things they were talking about, education. And part of the problem now is all these pivots and resets trying to gin up momentum. It's already too late. People aren't paying that much attention. And you keep changing what you say isn't very interesting. I think that scares me, similar to you, is the rise of reform. If Nigel Farage is to be believed, they're now close to 100,000 members. And there was apparently a surge after Kemi Badenoch was elected Tory leader. So now we're looking at, given we now know from the recent Tory contest that the Tory party's membership is about 125,000, we're now looking at a Reform Party that is surging in the polls and potentially now has close to the same number of members as the British Conservative Party. You've got Elon Musk mouthing off from across the Atlantic saying he's going to give millions of pounds to reform as some sort of weird fuck you to Keir Starmer. I don't know where we go from here, resetting 6 months in. And the thing I think should happen that feels pretty unlikely, given the only thing Keir Starmer stands for is attacking the left of the Labour Party, is I think there needs to be a reconciliation in Labour.
Thank you for listening to Over the Top and Under the Radar. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.
If you want to support the show, the best way is to find us on Patreon, search Over the Top and Under the Radar, and you can make a regular gift.
You can sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
And you can connect with us on social media at over_under_pod_.